Hi guys. Let's talk about implementing humor instruction into English language teaching. This is the article that I chose, and I was really drawn to this because I'm also an improv comedy teacher. So it's not uncommon for me to forget which hat I'm wearing in any given lesson. So I was interested in the best practices for blending English with comedy and humor. So why focus on humor in an English classroom? First of all, it makes learning more memorable. We can imagine that when students are having more fun, they're going to remember the lesson more, and comedy seems like a gateway for fun. Also, it relieves anxiety about how to engage with humor in the target culture. And I think for any of us who are learning another language or using another language regularly can relate to this. When you're trying to get to that level of fluency where you can really show your personality, humor is a part of that. Also, studying humor increases intercultural communicative competence, as well as develops critical thinking. In order to understand humor, you often have to go through many loops of meaning, abstraction, interpretation to understand why something is funny. So it's a cool way to develop critical thinking skills. Also, and this was really important to me, it strengthens digital and media literacy skills, which these are important 21st century skills that I often try to focus on in my classes. And so I thought that humor would be a really cool way to approach that aim. Okay, so how to look into humor. In the article, he said that to remember that the goal is not to produce funny students, but to produce students who, but to familiarize learners with a variety of conventional practices around humorous interaction so they are better able to take part in it. So how can we do this? First, we need to ask ourselves what linguistic structures, lexiconical items, and cultural understanding will learners need to achieve desired results. So he brings up an anecdote about showing an entire episode of The Simpsons in a high school Japanese class, thinking that they would be rolling on the floor laughing, but crickets, absolute silence. They didn't have any scaffolding to prepare them to even understand what was in the episode. There was no connection to the learning goals that they had been learning previously. And the materials that he selected, it was too long, it was too much. He would have been better off introducing certain things, playing little clips, reviewing why that was funny, like really bringing it into a classroom environment instead of just tossing it out there. So the desired results. With comedy, there can be 4 possible results: identifying it, comprehending it, responding to it, and then producing your own style of comedy. So here's a framework we can use to move through, keeping in mind the cultural background, proficiency level, and needs of your learners should greatly inform what aspects of humor instruction you implement into the curriculum. So in this article, he was working with Japanese teenagers, and he taught his humor classes for the groups that were about to study abroad in America. So you can see how that really met the needs of the learner. And since they were studying abroad in America, he focused on American styles of comedy. So in order to sort of run this test on yourself, does my situation work with teaching humor? Ask, are learners likely to encounter this form of humor when communicating, either face-to-face or online in the target language? Is this form of humor likely to be challenging for the students to understand? For example, because of a relative lack of the same humor in their native culture. And third, does instruction on this form of humor provide value beyond just humor? So, such as insights into the target culture. So the thing that really stuck out to me here is empowering students to engage online in online communities. Yes, so this is a framework that we can use before bringing humor to our students. Okay, so in the article, he focused on these 3 types of humor: verbal irony. So this is sarcasm, as well as a word that I had never learned before, jocularity. Is that what it is? Yeah, jocularity, which is like sarcasm. Sarcasm is a positive language with a negative intent, and jocularity is negative language with a positive intent. Like if somebody cooks you a delicious meal and you say, wow, you're a horrible cook. That's technically not sarcasm, that's jocularity. And with these 3 forms of comedy or of humor, he gives the rationale for why to teach this. And generally, these are ubiquitous features of conversation in English-speaking cultures. So by empowering our kids with understanding about this, they're better able to engage. Also, a failure to detect that these things are funny and why they're funny can lead to confusion and embarrassment. So with sarcasm or with verbal irony, comprehending it can be confusing because oftentimes the true meaning is the opposite, or it's an exaggeration, or it's an understatement. So he suggests scaffolding this concept, talking about the different verbal and language cues that you encounter with sarcastic comments, such as, wow, baseball is really exciting, or wow, baseball is really exciting. So we can teach our students these verbal cues, such as really versus really, and physical cues, such as rolling our eyes. So these are pieces of the concept of verbal irony that we can scaffold with our students, teach, see lots of examples of, and then give them the opportunity to practice. With memes, the rationale is basically that our students will be able to interact with millions of English speakers around the world. Memes are quickly becoming a universal language, so it will inspire confidence using social media. Also, memes are usually these short messages that are linguistically easy to figure out, like the vocabulary, and it becomes a cool critical thinking challenge to figure out what the meaning is, why it's funny, and it often gives insight into social issues. With satirical news, the rationale in teaching this, again, is that it's a ubiquitous feature of social media, but also if our students aren't prepared to encounter this on the internet, they might mistake it for real news. So it's cool to teach different types of news, satirical news, fake news, as an increasingly important 21st century skill, digital and media literacy. And the scaffolding techniques he brings up here are talking about stylistic cues. So satirical news will often have a tabloid-like appearance, a casual headline, vague details, you know, Florida man, blah, blah, blah. And we can really encourage our students to think critically. Is this article newsworthy? Is the article believable? And of these 3 forms of comedy, satirical news is definitely the most complex, and it requires the highest degree of cultural literacy, awareness of current events, and it can lead to deeper understandings and interests of political and social issues. So this is a really cool thing that you can bring to upper level classes. Okay, so yeah, just to repeat, he doesn't suggest that we just thrust something that we think is funny into our students' vision and expect them to understand. Just like with any subject, we have to offer careful scaffolding, a connection to the overall learning goals, and really carefully select and curate our materials so that they're relevant to what our students are learning and where our students are going. So some connections I saw to some of the other things we've been talking about with the 12 principles of language learning. I think teaching humor is a really good example of meaningful learning. Also, there's a lot of intrinsic motivation built in because it's enjoyable. And there's a strong language culture connection, not only to cultures of the target language, but I'm seeing the whole digital culture as being really relevant for our students to understand humor. Within the 6 principles of exemplary teaching, he suggests we have both content and language objectives when we teach humor. Again, linking it back to grammar points or sentence structures that we're talking about in general. Also, this really incorporates critical thinking to understand why something is funny and then how to respond to it, and then also how to produce your own humor in that style, all really activates higher level thinking skills. Also, teaching humor offers many forms of input and many forms of output. Input, we're seeing memes, we're reading satirical news, we're listening to sarcastic comments, and then output, we're figuring out how to interpret, how to explain, sometimes how to produce, and sometimes how to create. So there's lots of different ways to engage with this sort of material. And for me, what really resonated with my teaching approach is that I work with a lot of international school kids. So I do think that it's important for them to understand humor of different cultures and internet humor. Also, I work with a lot of middle and high school aged kids, and they're experimenting with all sorts of parts of their developing character, and they're experimenting with their humor styles. So I think it could be really cool to really break these things down, understand what they are, why they're funny, and practice creating from their own sense of self. I see humor and the role of humor in international digital communities, such as social media, as being really big and really important. And talking about humor provides tools for understanding the world. And I'm always looking for ways to empower my students to have autonomy in their own learning and their own English journey. And I think giving them tools to understand and interpret humor is a great way to do that. And finally, I'm mostly a speaking and writing teacher, and I'm always looking for ways to make writing activities and discussion more meaningful. And humor is a really approachable way to get into big topics with a likely chance that my students will care about it. So that's all I've got for today. Thank you so much for listening, and see you guys around.